Edwin, there are many definitions of yoga, and it seems like the Bhagavad Gita says that yoga is skill in action. Patanjali says that yoga is the quieting of the mind. They seem to be having some contradictions. Can you talk about that?
Sure, yeah. It's, I think, a very interesting and important theme. Krishna in the Gita, I believe it's the beginning of chapter 4, says that there were two systems of yoga in the ancient days, and that one of them had become lost. And then he says in Arjuna, I'm reestablishing that the lost system to you, because you're a bhaktosi, because you're my friend, you're my devotee, and so forth. So the Gita acknowledges that there were two distinct systems, and the Gita presents itself as reintroducing one of those two. But the one that, the sort of generic understanding of yoga is the Patanjalian type of yoga, which is the definition that Patanjali gives, which is yoga chitta vritti nirodha, that yoga is the stilling of the mind. So that definition is basically one where one becomes inactive or transactive, one ceases activity, right? It's nirodha, it's stilling the mind, it's pratyahara, it's withdrawing the senses, it's involuting consciousness. And that type of yoga, we see that. I mean, clearly the Yoga Sutras is dedicated to that, but we see it also in the older texts, pre-Patanjali. We see when the term yoga is used in the Upanishads, it refers to that type of yoga. It's in the forest, it's by the side of a running stream, it's in a cave, it involves closing down the mind. So we see that definition also in the Moksha Dharma, which is a section of the Mahabharata, which also is a good source for early yoga. So in the texts before Patanjali, in Patanjali, when we see this term yoga being used, and the yogi, the one who does this yoga, it refers to this kind of very radical, actually, withdrawal from the world, or closing out the world, and you go to a secluded place where there's no distractions, and slowly close down the external, and then even close down the mechanisms of perception, the senses and the mind. And nirodha, the ultimate goal is complete and utter nirodha of the mind. So that was the understanding of yoga, and even Arjuna has that understanding. Even Arjuna has that understanding that's what yoga is, because twice at the beginning of, I think, the 3rd chapter or the beginning of the 5th chapter, in 2 places in the Gita, he's confused. He says, Krishna, I don't understand you. On the one hand, you're telling me, to do yoga. On the other hand, you're telling me to fight this battle. I don't understand this. So he, too, has kind of been accustomed to the idea that yoga means renunciation of the world. So what the Gita is doing, and explicitly doing, Krishna clearly says, he acknowledges this. He doesn't reject that type of yoga. He describes it, especially in the 2nd chapter, especially in the 5th and the 6th chapter. The 6th chapter especially is jnana yoga, raja yoga, which is that Patanjalian type of yoga. So the Gita honors that and discusses it and accepts it. But the Gita, Krishna is very clear, Arjuna, this is not for you. This type of yoga is not for you. And the Gita says, but there's another kind of yoga. And it became lost, because otherwise where is it? Why isn't it discussed in the Upanishads? Why isn't it discussed in the other ancient texts? So Krishna then says, it's become lost, and I am coming to reestablish it. And that is the yoga of action. Action in the world, not pratyahara, not nirodha, but action. And it takes, in the Bhagavad Gita, it manifests in 2 ways. First as karma yoga, which is the first kind of discussion of how to act in the world, is the karma yoga, which is in chapter 2 and 3, which is basically doing your duty. But the pivotal, what makes it yoga as opposed to karma, what makes it yoga, it's karma yoga as opposed to karma, because karma also means doing your duty in the world. Like if you just use the word karma, it means to do your duty. Otherwise it's vikarma. If you're not doing your duty, it's vikarma. So karma means to do your duty. But what makes it yoga is that you have to do the duty with no attachment fruit, no desire for anything in return.
You don't do things to get anything back.
To get anything back, and then just quickly to finish up this, this sort of outline of this, and then that type of action, then the Gita is going to take that even to an even higher place in the Gita, which is doing your duty in the world, but then doing it as an offering to God, to Ishvara, and then it becomes bhakti yoga. So action in the world takes these two modalities, one which actually, which is just karma yoga, which is not necessarily theistic. Karma yoga doesn't have to be theistic. Like Gandhi was a karma yogin, but he wasn't, he didn't subscribe to the bhakti of the Gita. But then that becomes bhakti yoga. So, so two types of yoga. One defined by Patanjali as chitta vritti nirodha, and the Gita accepts that in chapter 6. And then the second type of yoga, which is karma sukaushalam, skill in action, that's defined in chapter 2. And then a couple of verses later, this, samatvam yoga muchyate, that what is yoga? It's some equanimity, which is the same as skill in action, because equanimity means to be peaceful whether you get success or failure. So if you actually have no attachment to the results, if you have no desire, then you're not going to be, your mind is going to be equanimous. You're not going to be happy if you attain a result and sad if you don't attain it. Normally, when we act in the world, we attain our result, we're happy. If we get it, and if we're not, we're despondent. So that's sukha dukkha. So absolutely,
up and down.
Absolutely.
But in the second chapter of Patanjali, isn't he really kind of telling us to do something? Like in the first time, the first chapter, he's telling us that yoga chitta vritti nirodha. But then the second one, it seems like this is what you need to do. So he's not just saying that is the definition, but in order to get there, you got to do something.
Yes,
no?
You do. You do the kriya yoga, which kriya is the same root as karma, kra. But the goal of the kriya that you're doing is to prepare to become sufficiently sattvic so that you can ultimately attain the state of chitta vritti nirodha. It's not a goal unto itself. The kriya, the svadhyaya, tapaha svadhyaya, ishvara pranidhana, and then the limbs of yoga, those are not goals unto themselves. They are just practices. They're kriya, there's practices, they're actions, but their goal is to make you sattvic. I think in 2.11 or 2.10, we can look it up. Patanjali says, if you do kriya yoga, then you can still the vrittis, right? Tad vritayaha. Let's have a quick look. So it's 2.11. Dhyana heyas tad vritayaha. So the goal of kriya yoga is to prepare the mind, and when the mind is sufficiently sattvic, then it can be nirodha. Kriya yoga is not a goal unto itself. That's different from the Gita. In the Gita, karma yoga is a goal unto itself. Bhakti yoga is a goal unto itself. It's not preparatory to something else. So whatever actions we find in chapter 2, their goal is simply to prepare the practitioner to be able to eventually get the viveka, right? Why are we doing the 8 limbs? To get the viveka, the discrimination, to be able to chitta vritti nirodha. So the goal of Patanjali is chitta vritti nirodha. Any actions that might be there, it's secondary to that. Like the Maitri verses, everybody likes to quote the Maitri, Karuna verses. But really, they're also, they're wonderful things, but they're also secondary to or supportive of the ultimate goal, which is chitta vritti nirodha. In the Gita, however, the chitta vritti nirodha path is one path, but the other path is karma yoga, which in its highest expression becomes bhakti yoga. That's a goal unto itself. It's not a chitta vritti nirodha practice. It is a vritti practice, but the vritti in karma yoga is dharma, dharma, dharma. What's my dharma? What's my dharma? How do I do this dharma with no personal... That's the vritti. The vritti in bhakti yoga is, how do I offer this to Ishvara? How do I offer this to Ishvara? How do I offer this to Ishvara with no personal investment? So these are vritti practices.
And putting it in like practical terms, in this day and age, it would be really nice, and maybe there are some people that have the time and the luxury to go to a cave and be able to quiet themselves and just focus on, I'm going to just do this. But the reality for most people is that they have to work, they have families, they have children, they have responsibilities. So what do? How is this going to help either Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras, or the Bhagavad Gita? Is it really more that they're really more warriors in this day and age, that they're having to, fight for their survival or fight for their families or fight for anything else? And so can they still be in a state of yoga without going to India and being in completely in a solitary cave?
Sure. And which of course is the teachings of karma yoga, that we can remain in, and bhakti yoga. We remain in this world, we do our dharmas. Everybody has multiple dharmas, right? So you have your professional dharma. You mentioned kshatriya, or warrior, administrator. So that's one dharma. But there are different professions. There's also gender dharma, and there's parental dharma. Gender, like a female dharma and a male dharma. I mean,
within each person, we both have a male and a female gender?
We're talking about ancient India, right? Okay. So you would have, as a female, you would have a set of dharmas that corresponds with a female dharmas, in addition to a professional dharma, in addition to a parental dharma, in addition to being a daughter to parents. So there's multiple dharmas.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand in this day and age, because I don't understand from other times, and trying to understand some of these obscure teachings. How do they apply to us now? Has there been an evolution that maybe some things don't make sense or we don't understand them and they don't work for us anymore?
Well, the notion of dharma obviously changes, but the principle that you can do whatever that dharma is, your duty, obviously that's changed, right? Your gender, you're not going to accept the gender dharma. I mean, women nowadays are not going to accept the gender dharma of a woman 2,000 years ago, anywhere in the world, not just...
are subjugated to that.
Okay,
that's a whole other conversation.
But the point is, dharmas may change. How we define dharmas may change. But the principle of karma yoga is not what is the external manifestation of dharma. The principle is, whatever that dharma is, to do it without attachment to the fruits, to the results. That makes it yoga. It doesn't matter what the dharma is, okay? Whether it's warrior, administrator, a merchant, or an artisan, or an intellectual. The principle, what makes it yoga, is giving up the desire to get something from it. It's desire that causes samsara. When we do an action out of desire, then we plant a seed. That's how the seed gets planted. If an act is done out of desire, it plants a seed. Once the seed is planted, it has to bear a fruit. Samsara is nothing other than that. Right? We act all the time. We're planting trillions of seeds, so there's trillions of fruits. And when we die, they haven't all manifest. So we own them. We have to experience them, and that's why there is a next lifetime. The reason there is a next lifetime is nothing other than because we have to experience those fruits that we have created for ourselves. So the principle of karma yoga it's not a question of modernity or antiquity or what did women do today and what did, how is that different from before and what's a warrior today. The principle that may change, the externals may change, but what makes it yoga, that doesn't change. And what makes it yoga is to do these things purely as if we're doing karma yoga, duty for the sake of duty, with I'm not thinking I'm going to make money out of this, I'm going to get fame, I'm going to get reputation, I'm going to get anything at all. And that makes it karma yoga. What makes it bhakti yoga is that we sincerely are offering it to God, again, with no expectation of result, of fruit. So whatever we do, we're somehow in our minds finding a way of offering that to a higher being. That makes it bhakti.
What about those that don't subscribe to the idea of a higher being?
They wouldn't be interested in bhakti yoga.
And they can still do the yoga.
They could do karma yoga. They could do Patanjali in yoga. And they could do so many other yogas, right? But they wouldn't be doing bhakti.
What if the desire is yoga chitta vritti nirodha?
But that's an aklishta desire. Remember, Patanjali says the vrittis are klishta or aklishta. They're either coming from the kleshas, ignorance, or they're coming, or they're not. So if the desire is body-mind, I'm right. What are the kleshas? The kleshas are avidya, ignorance. What is ignorance? I'm body-mind. So if we act in the world from a place of avidya, ignorance, I'm body, mind, the desires that come from that are the ones that plant the seeds. But if we act in the world from a place of viveka, of knowledge, I'm not the body, mind, I'm the Atman, and we act in the world in a way that's supportive of realizing our Atman, that's called aklishta. No seeds. So if we desire for the Atman, or we desire to do bhakti, or we desire Ishvara, these are not the same category of desires, and they don't plant seeds. In fact, there's a type of bhakti called raganuga. It's even called raganuga, yes.
What is that? I've never heard of this.
Oh, that's another story.
Is that a new one?
No, it's a term that goes back at least to the 16th century. It means intense desire for Ishvara. Intense, absolute, to the point of almost becoming insane. If you look at the gopis in the Krishna stories, they become mad. They become absolutely mad in their separation when Krishna leaves them. So their desire for Krishna, the point is so intense. But those kinds of desires they're not the same as the body-mind avidya desires. So they're totally different type of thing. And so to desire the Atman, to go back to your question, in the Vedanta tradition, it's called mumuksha. It's one of the requirements of the spiritual journey. You have to have a desire for moksha. Mumukshavana kirtan. It's a good desire, because if you don't have a desire for moksha, why will you take up yoga? You won't do anything.
That makes sense.
You wouldn't. I mean, you can't act unless there's some motive for action, and motive is desire. So the question isn't, desire, but what kind of a desire? Is it klishta or aklishta? Is it coming from vidya or avidya? That's the issue. But anyway, to sort of tie this together a little bit then, so therefore, there are still today people that go and they sit and meditate, whether that's a romantic cave in the Himalayas, but it could just be your room. You could create a little space somewhere. That's very difficult to do. I mean, we all think, I'm going to go off and sit in a cave. The reason we think that's because we get frustrated with life. Well, go sit in a cave and see how long you can last in a cave.
It'll be the same.
It'll be 2 days. It will be 2 days.
I have to go to the bathroom,
but apart from that, just that practice of chitta vritti nirodha is very stoic. It's very dry, and it's very arduous. Krishna says it in the Gita. Arjuna says it in the 12th chapter. Which of these is better? And Krishna says, well, they both lead to the same result, but but the bhakti is joyful and joyfully performed, and it's susukam. It's easy. The other practice is hard. If you're really, really doing the Patanjali, and not just for half an hour in the morning, if you're sitting in a cave doing that 24 hours, that is really austere.
You've done that.
Well, I've tried it, and I've enough to realize this. If you're really doing what Patanjali is saying, it's extremely arduous and dry. It is dry. It's not joyful.
This is my next question, and this is something that makes, I know that my students are very uncomfortable when we mention brahmacharya and celibacy. How does this fit into this whole practice of yoga? Do we all have to be celibate to be in a state of yoga? Is it easier?
Well, anyone can practice yoga. If we want to follow Patanjali in yoga, then we know very well that the niyamas, right? The yamas include brahmacharya, right? Ahimsam satya brahmacharya. It's a third niyama. It's a third yama. So at some point, if we want to attain the goal of Patanjali, the final goal, which is chitta vritti nirodha, tada drashtu svarupe vasthanam, so that the seer abides in its own nature. If we want to get to that ultimate grand finale, where consciousness perceives its own reality, is re-immersed in its own nature, as opposed to vritti sarupyam, as opposed to being absorbed in the vrittis. If we want to get to that stage, then yes, then brahmacharya is, at some point we're going to have to, because it means complete withdrawal of consciousness from absorption in the body and identification with the body and the ragas of the body. So if we're still experiencing, if our consciousness is still experiencing or absorbed in sexual impulses and desires, then it's not ready to be absorbed in its own nature. It's quite simple. to be absorbed in its own nature, it has to be able to withdraw completely from any other nature, from the vrittis.
And it's something that you have to do on your own. You can't do it with anybody else.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yeah. This is Patanjalian yoga. We're not talking about left-handed tantra. There may be other traditions that have a different narrative, but the Patanjalian yoga is ultimately, if you want to go all the way, then brahmacharya, it's right there. It's a yama. There's no va. It's not optional. These are the 8 limbs.
And there is no other definition of brahmacharya.
Not in the ancient. I mean, I know nowadays everybody's trying to wiggle out of this and say it means acting. It means walking in Brahman. But I mean, in brahmacharya is celibacy. That's what it means. It's what it means in all the classical Sanskrit texts. We can try to wiggle out of that.
Call it self-control.
Well, literally, it means, to walk. Chara is to walk. The word chara. So brahmacharya, one could make a case that etymologically means walking in Brahman. But if you're really walking in Brahman, you're going to be celibate. No, because it means you're absorbed in the pure nature of the consciousness. You're not absorbed in the world of desires and sexual attraction, which is all states of mind. It's states of mind. It's fantasy. It's samskara. So if you're actually walking in Brahman, of course you're going to be celibate. But the word brahmacharya, when we see it in the Sanskrit texts, we have to see what the word means in Sanskrit text, not what we want it to mean in the 21st century in the West, but what it means in the Sanskrit text. It means celibacy. Take it or leave it. But we may decide, well, I'm not going to take it, fine, but we shouldn't try to change the meaning of the word. The meaning of the word is celibacy. Just like ahimsa. People try to wiggle out of that. Ahimsa is non-violence. Ahimsa always meant vegetarianism. It always meant vegetarianism. If someone is following the vow of ahimsa in these texts, it was just assumed that person was not eating meat. It wasn't, it was just certainly the yoga commentaries. Ahimsa means not to kill animals.
Only animals?
Well, I mean, certainly animals.
What about if a warrior has to go and kill? If we go back to the Bhagavad Gita, where does ahimsa fit in?
That's not the path. That's not the karma yoga path. Remember, there's 2 different paths. So if we're following the 8 limbs of yoga, the Patanjalian path, that's the path that Krishna discusses in chapter 6. But if you're following the path of karma yoga, the rules change. And that path is a path of doing dharma. And now if you're doing dharma, there are those who are called upon to protect society, the army, the police force, the warrior caste, and for them, their dharma might be that they have to use violence according to the codes of Dharma, right? According to the time. Nowadays we have our codes of Dharma, Geneva Conventions. We have our own modern codes that what constitutes the appropriate use of violence, right? And back then they had similar things. So karma yoga then, if your Dharma calls on you to use violence in a dharmic way to protect, in the ideal world, to protect the state or whatever it might be, then you should do that. But that's different from the Patanjalian yoga. Patanjalian yoga, Patanjali says there's no exceptions. Jati, right? Desha, Kala, Samaya, Anavichinnaha, Sarvabhauma Mahavratam. That these vows, brahmacharya and ahimsa, there's no exception based on jati, your caste, or desha, or country, or condition, or time. They are universal.
Universal and timeless.
And timeless. So if we want to do Patanjalian yoga, we have to be brahmachari, ahimsa, all of those things. If we want to do karma yoga, the rules change. So then we can, if we're a warrior caste, we might be able to, we're supposed to use violence in certain controlled contexts. If we're doing our dharma, then sexuality is appropriate for the grihastha ashram for the age of 25 to 50. That's when people are allowed to be, or are according to Vedic codes. That's the time for family life and sexuality. So the rules change.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So there are not a lot of yogis, true yogis out there then.
Well, I think what I think, and I'd like to make this point. And that is, satyam is very important. Maybe we don't like these things. And maybe we might we might decide, well, I'm not ready to follow this yama or that yama, but we shouldn't try and change the meaning of the words. Let's at least respect satya. So we may say, look, I'm not ready to be a brahmachari, or I'm not ready to give up this part of my diet or that. Fine, but at least be honest about that, and not try to make the words mean something else, and not try to wiggle out of the meaning of the words.
Well, there's so many other things that we can practice. You know, we can...
Absolutely, we don't have to practice
so
Patanjali or any of this. But if we are claiming to be following the path of Patanjali, let's at least respect what the words mean and what they've always meant for many, many centuries. And let's not try to make brahmacharya mean something else, or ahimsa mean something else.
Of course.
Yes.
Thank you for answering all my questions that I have so many of. Thank you.
The principle is, whatever that dharma is, to do it without attachment to the fruits, to the results. That makes it yoga. It doesn't matter what the dharma is, okay? Whether it's, you know, warrior, or administrator, or merchant, or an artisan, or an intellectual. The principle, what makes it yoga, is giving up the desire to get something from it. It's desire that causes samsara. When we do an action out of desire, then we plant a seed. That's how the seed gets planted. If an act is done out of desire, it plants a seed. Once the seed is planted, it has to bear a fruit. Samsara is nothing other than that. Right? We act all the time. We're planting trillions of seeds, so there's trillions of fruits. And when we die, they haven't all manifest. So we own them. We have to experience them, and that's why there is a next lifetime. The reason there is a next lifetime is nothing other than because we have to experience those fruits that we have created for ourselves.